my name is Lindsay Wilkes, and I'm the owner of the Cottage Mama and author of the book So Classic Clothes for Girls. Thanks so much for joining me today on Lessons with Lindsay. Today we're talking about one of my absolute favorite techniques, piping. I'm going to show you how to create your own piping and then how to apply it to your garments, such as on a Peter Pan collar. So let's get started. I talk about piping quite often in my book, So Classic Clothes for Girls. So you'll find additional tips in my book here. But I think, being a visual learner myself, that you're going to really enjoy actually seeing these tips live. So first we're going to need to cut a bias strip of fabric. You can check out my other video on how to cut your own bias strips of fabric over at sewathomeclasses.com. But for here, I've already got one pre-cut for us at about 1 inch. So you're going to need to consider when you're doing piping what your seam allowance is. So we've got this handy dandy piping magic ruler here that's really helpful when figuring out what size piping you need for what seam allowance you're using. So I'm just going to show you here real quick. So if we've got this piping here, and we line it up, say we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is found more commonly in heirloom sewing, you can simply place the piece of piping in the little groove here at the 1/4 inch, and you're going to know exactly how much to cut off so that you can line this up with the edge of your garment where you're sewing a 1/4 inch. So that's just a wonderful little tool and tip to make your life a bit easier. But for me, most of my patterns are sewn at a 1/2 inch, and all the patterns in my book are sewn at a 1/2 inch. So we're going to focus on that seam allowance for today. So here I've got my bias strip, and I have this little piece of baby cording. Now I purchased my baby cording online. You can search your local sewing shop and see what kind of cording they have. Some people also like to use yarn that's a little bit, you don't want something too fluffy, you want something that's pretty dense so that the piping doesn't squish it down too much. But baby cording is perfect for children's garments. So we lay our cording here in the middle of our bias strip, and then we're going to just fold over the bias strip on top of our cord and line up the edges. Just like that, and we'll take this over to the sewing machine. So before we start sewing our piping, I want to talk to you a little bit about some different feet options that you have when sewing piping. So our first option is going to be just your standard presser foot. So if you don't have any fancy accessory feet with your machine and you have just a standard presser foot, you're going to be totally fine to sew piping. So that's our first foot here. Another option, and a lot of machines come with this foot as well, is your zipper foot. Your zipper foot's going to help you get nice and close to the cording and sew it very easily. However, I think when you're sewing with baby cording, your standard foot is going to be okay. But if you're using a thicker cording, you're going to want to use something like a zipper foot, or I've got 2 other options for you here. We've got a left mini cording foot and then the center mini cording foot, both of which are great accessories to add to your feet collection. You want to get the one that goes with your specific machine, and this has the cording just fitting into this little tiny groove in here, and it's going to help move your stitches right along that cording and make your life a lot easier. So if you're sewing a lot of children's garments or sewing with mini cording often, this is going to be a great foot that I think that you're going to want to get your hands on. So today I'm going to use the left mini cording foot just because I really like that one. You can sew with the needle in the center position, and it's going to feed the cord right next to the needle. So now we're going to snap on our left mini cording foot here. Just snap that on. We want to have our needle in the center position. And then I like to actually set my stitch length to a 3 for this. Okay, so now we're going to take our bias strip of fabric with our cording, and we're simply going to wrap it around here so that our cording is in the middle. And we are going to put this under the presser foot and lower it down. Now we want to make sure that this cord is right in that little groove that I showed you. And it is. And our needle's in the center position. So we're going to start our stitching. Now let's back stitch a couple times. And we're just going to make sure that this stays nice and lined up as you go. Here. All right, let's get sewing here. All right, I'm going to double check that we're staying lined up here with our bias. Okay. See how nicely that just feeds that cord in there. So easy. But again, if you're using your standard presser foot, you're just going to want to get up nice and close to that cord. We're almost finished getting this strip sewn. And you can make your piping strips as long as you'd like. If you'd like to join some bias strips together to make extra long piping, if you think you're going to use a lot, by all means do that. Okay. All right, now let's cut our threads here. And there we have it. Look how pretty that looks. A nice piece of piping that's all ready to go into a seam. So now we're going to talk about inserting piping into a Peter Pan collar. Peter Pan collars are one of my absolute favorite additions to children's clothing. I just think they're so sweet and they have such a classic vintage appeal. And adding piping into that collar just makes it so special. So here we go. I have a Peter Pan collar that I've cut. This is a pattern from my book, So Classic Clothes for Girls. And I have my collar here, both pieces. I like to mark the back side of the collar with just a fabric marking pen here, just so I remember what's the back and what's the front, because sometimes the back and the front look very similar, but the curve along the neck hole is a little bit different. So we need to just make note of that. So we're going to take one piece of our collar and we're going to take this tape. This is one of my favorite products. It's called Wash Away Wonder Tape, and it's a double-sided sticky tape that you can sew through and it's not going to gum up your needle. And once you launder your garment, it's going to disappear and wash away. So it's wonderful for holding trims in place and anything that you don't want to use pins for because you think that the pins might make the trim a little bit wonky. So I love, love, love my Wash Away Wonder Tape. So I've applied my tape to the collar here. And what I'm going to do is remove this paper backing. So see, it just peels off nice and easily here, and it's double-sided sticky. And it doesn't look so pretty going around the curve there, but that doesn't matter. We don't need to worry about the tape looking pretty. So see, we're peeling that off here. We have our tape. Then we're gonna take our piping. Now I've got a piping here that is gonna give me a 1/2 inch seam allowance so that I'm gonna be able to line the edge of my piping up with the edge of my collar. Now again, you need to really pay careful attention to your seam allowance. If you've got a 5/8 or a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you need to make sure that your piping is the appropriate width. So we're going to apply this piping along a curve, and in order to do that, we're going to need to clip some of this seam allowance to get it to lay nice and smooth along the curve. So let's take our scissors here, and I just clip all the way because we've got quite a bit of curve here. And we're just going to snip, snip all the way down here. Now you may go back and want to add some additional snips in some of the, where the curve is a little bit tighter. But I just kind of space them out pretty evenly to start. Here, let's move our collar out of the way. All right. So this takes a little time, but again, you know, these little steps are what are going to make your garment look truly professional. And they may take a little extra time, but trust me, it's worth it. And our kids are worth it. All right, so I'm snipping along here so that we can lay this nice and flat. Okay, I think we're almost there. We'll just go all the way, you know, just in case. I always like to cut a little more piping than I think we'll need because you just never know when you're laying it on the curve. Okay, so let's take our piping here. We need the piping to point towards the inside of the collar because eventually we're going to turn this right side out and that's going to have our piping going towards the outside of the collar. But to start, we need to have it pointing towards the inside. So when I say inside, I'm talking about going this direction towards the inside of the collar. So let's take our piping here and we're going to lay it down on our tape, lining up the edge of the piping with the edge of the collar. And right here was where I was talking about the fact that you might want to snip if you don't feel like that's laying flat. But I think that's actually going to work just fine for us for this. You're just going to work this all the way around the edge, sticking it to the tape. You know, I don't know if you've ever tried to put pins in piping. It's certainly possible if you don't have this, but sometimes it just makes it not lay quite as flat as I like it to. So we're going all the way around here. And this is going to be so pretty. You can do, you know, a solid collar like this with a patterned piping, or you can do a solid piping. See here, I want this to lay a little bit flatter. So I'm going to come in and give this another little clip and another little clip here. Yes, there, that's going to be nice. But anyway, you can do two patterned fabrics. You can do all kinds of things with your piping. Okay, so now we've got our piping laid around the edge of the collar here. Okay, so we're going to need to take this over to our sewing machine and stitch the piping to the collar, just using a 3.0 basting stitch to make sure that we secure it before we add on the other side of our collar. So let's go over to the sewing machine and get that sewn. Okay, so now we're going to place our collar with the piping that we've stuck down with our Wonder Tape under our left mini cording foot. Now let's get our cording lined up nicely in this little groove. Ah, there we go, that's looking good. Okay, we are going to take a few back stitches because I like to do that. And we are gonna begin sewing around here. You may need to move a little slower around these curves, and that's okay. Just keep on going. You see how that cording is going so nicely in that groove. Okay, again, I want to slow down a little bit as I get to this next curve. Okay, I'm going to straighten this out a little bit here. Okay, now let's take a few back stitches, secure in place, and cut our thread. So here you can see we've sewn our piping to the first piece of our collar. It looks really nice and pretty. You can see on the other side. Now, if I were doing this at home, I'd use a matching thread, but just wanted you guys to be able to see our stitching here. So we're using a contrasting thread. So now we are going to add our other collar piece on top of this one that we have here. So let's take our other collar here and we are going to line these up. So we want to get this all nice and lined up here, and I like to flip it to this side over here for my next row of stitching because I like to be able to see this line that I've done before. So let's take our pins. This time we are going to pin this together because we want to make sure this is nice and lined up. I like to just pin the middle part here just to keep the collar together. Do it on both ends and kind of work your way to the middle here. Make sure we stay lined up. Okay, so I'm feeling pretty good here. So we're going to take this back over to our sewing machine and we're going to stitch down again. Okay, so let's bring this over here. And we are just going to put that little cord in the groove. Let's make sure we're nicely in there. Okay. And we're going to sew these together. Now, for those of you not using a mini cording foot, I do like to have my second row of stitching, if possible, go ever so slightly to the left of my original stitching line. I just feel like that really squeezes the piping out and makes it really nice. And if you find that you didn't get close enough to your cording, it's not going to be a problem. You're just going to go back and sew a little bit closer. Now, I think people think piping is really a difficult addition to a garment, but it's really not. It just takes a little extra time. So I'm going to remove this pin so it doesn't get in our way here. Here we go. Move a little bit slower around this curve here. I'm going to straighten out a bit. There we go. Okay. Now let's cut our thread. And we're going to remove our pins here. And what I like to do is just take a little peek-see, see how we did. Okay, see if I think I went close enough to the cording, or if I want to come back and get a little bit closer, but let's see. Check over here. See how we did here. Well, now, I'm feeling pretty good about this here. So I am going to trim this seam allowance with my pinking shears. I like to use these because I feel like they really help the fabric lay nice and smooth, and we can get pretty close to our stitching. So let's take our pinking shears, or if you don't have pinking shears, you can certainly clip or use your scissors and just cut down the seam allowance. And like I said, if you felt like you didn't get close enough to the piping or you wanted it to be squeezed out a little bit more, you just go back and you just sew a little bit closer each time. It's not a problem. Definitely don't want to stress about that. All right, just don't clip through your stitching. Okay. So we're going to turn this right side out here. And you've got your pretty piping here poking through the edge of your collar. And all we're going to really need to do next is just press out the collar. And voila, we have this beautiful piping detail. And it really was that easy. So today you've learned all about piping. You've learned how to create your own custom piping and how to insert it into a seam. This is one of my favorite techniques for children's clothing, so I hope that you'll really give it a try. Thank you so much for joining me today on Lessons with Lindsay. If you're looking for more sewing tutorials, free patterns and tips, visit my website, The Cottage Mama, www.thecottagemama.com. And until next time, happy sewing.